Who's not been to a safety day before? Good. All right. It's a fairly flexible sort of schedule. The idea of a safety day came about many years ago, primarily driven by the United States Parachute Association, the USPA. They promoted this idea of practicing, doing work with AE licensed qualified jumpers and above. And the reason came about because they identified that commonly errors and mistakes weren't just being student related, they were actually qualified jumpers. We take part in a much broader, more sophisticated type of jumping these days. You could be wingsuiting, CF and everything else, and as a result of that, sometimes what we do requires just a little bit more thought. So purpose of safety days, partially to review and practice our own safety procedures, also perhaps to learn new ideas that are more directly suited to you, and perhaps a little less so today, but historically I've done, for example, a malfunctions lecture that is specifically more tailored to how the canopies that you fly would fly or interact with each other if you had reserves and mains open at the same time. And that, I believe, is still available on YouTube should you want to see that. And then primarily it's an opportunity for you to talk to us and to ask questions. If there's any specific topic or something that you want to cover, then today's the opportunity for you to do that. And that's what I mean by having quite a fluid and flexible sort of schedule and timetable today. The only thing that's come up in the last few weeks that someone's asked me is what should we do in a canopy collision situation? There was a group discussion amongst a few people, and sort of my best response to that was, okay, come safety day, I'll do canopy collision. So I'm going to do that, but I'm also quite happy to revisit pretty much any topics we've done before. The only one that I occasionally get asked for is methods of instruction. That doesn't fall as part of a safety day. We do coach the coaches weekends. We did one a few weeks ago. We'll be doing several of those during the year. Have a look at the events book on Facebook. Yeah.
Could I ask you to do something on landing directions for a simulation? Because I know I'm a little bit confused between standard approaches and swooping approaches and how they interact, particularly winds in this sort of direction today.
Yes, it's really awkward. Okay, so we can talk about what was required of us from a HPLA point of view. And I will express that I'm not a huge fan of the concept, but I understand why. So yeah, we can talk about that. So if you've got anything that creeps up as the day goes on, by all means ask. Commonly in the afternoon we'll do a more practical session, suspended harness. That's not, again, directly part of the timetable this year, but if someone strongly wants to feel they should do suspended harness, you're more than welcome to ask, and we would spend a little bit of time down there. Any questions or anything specific before we start?
Apology for me for interrupting you.
That's no problem. That's why we do this sort of casual intro first.
I broke the coffee machine.
You broke the coffee machine.
Sorry.
Okay, so this was written by a guy called Bill Booth. I've got several quotes that I use for various lessons. Bill Booth was one of the original designers of the vector container, or what came before it was called a Wonder Hog. So he was involved in what is now called UPT, United Parachute Technologies, as their for many, many years. So he knows an awful lot about equipment. He's also a tandem instructor and very much one of the original designers of tandem skydiving programs. So okay, his first term is very gear specific. You should educate yourself about gear and then only jump gear that is designed for how you jump. But in reality, it also serves equally well that you should educate yourself about all types of skydiving that you plan to take part in and understand everything about it. The equipment that you're going to use, the facilities that are made available for you, perhaps even why they're made available, how some of those things function. So many fatalities occur because of decisions jumpers make before even getting in the aeroplane. Don't join that group, be smarter than that. So he's essentially saying if we have knowledge before we get in an aeroplane, we can make clever decisions before we get in the aeroplane. An example right now, yes, we've enforced a B license minimum because we're seeing gusty, quite high turbulent winds. But at the same time, the personal capacity to say, okay, how do these winds affect me and my parachute and my choice to jump, rather than the blinkered, oh well, they're jumping, so it must be okay for me. So it's about being clever and sensible with your own personal decisions. They're the sort of things that keep you safe. we used to see, unfortunately, when I became initially chief instructor back in 2009, a common occurrence was people would go abroad and we'd see Brits injured or worse while they were abroad. And one of those...
Sorry, John Carter, can we borrow you for a minute, please? It's not a medical emergency, it's a medical query.
Joys of being British Skydiving's medical advisor. Just a quick question. Yeah, so we used to see injuries and silly incidents take place abroad, and some of that was to an extent because people weren't very good at making their own decisions. They were almost over-chaperoned by their chief instructors, particularly within the UK system, and so they were basically incapacitated or unable to wake up one morning and think, actually, I need to look after myself, because in this environment, in this foreign environment, perhaps nobody else is doing that for them, and they were doing silly things. So making your own decisions can be a very wise thing. I'm here to guide people as chief instructor, but you will often basically see me trying to get the individual to make their own decisions, because that makes you far more self-reliant and independent when you go to other places. Welcome to the tower. Quick divergence from safety day. This is the new facility that we've worked on over the winter. Yes, the door will be replaced. That's why it looks like that. There is a new door up there. But otherwise, we're pretty much there. Henry spotted that straight away when they showed the door. This area is primarily going to be used for progression, briefs, debriefs, both groups, individuals, FS coaching. We've got the verbal screen up there as well, so people know what lifts they're on, and then we've got the two primary briefing and debriefing areas available. So we're going to be using this mainly as our hub during the day. It's also then available for people to use their laptops, although you've probably seen in the hangar we've been moving them around progressively over the winter to work out where they are, but we have the work zone down in the hangar as well. We've improved the internet service to here, and we've had a specific fibre optic line put in, so that now allows decent internet down in the hangar as well. So come along, work here for the day, work, use the work zone, and pop a few jumps in at lunchtime. There was a lady sat at the work zone the other day, and she's got her, obviously doing whatever Zoom meeting you see. It's looking good. So yeah, welcome to the new facilities. All right, general review of last year. That's the figures we had from British Skydiving. There were about 210,000 jumps made in the UK last year, which is a really good recovery from obviously the COVID year of 2020. The overall were just under 150,000 qualified licensed jumps made in the UK. Of that layout, we had 37,000 slots or heads, people jumps in the aircraft. Some of those were tandems, so we did about 35,000 jumps last year. Of those, about 30,000 were made by qualified jumpers. So we account for about 1 in 5 or 20% of the UK jumps for A licensed people. So we do regard ourselves as a fairly big centre from that point of view. Malfunctions, UK-wide there were 177, that's 1 in 1,183. So malfunctions are generally happening out there. Who has malfunctions? Everyone, but mostly qualified jumpers, yeah. You do get the odd student one, and in fact last year was a bit of a weird one. We had 24 malfunctions of reserve rides last year in 30,000. So in fact our statistics were better than the British average last year. We were slightly safer. It's not always that case. We sort of bobble in and out of being better or slightly worse than the national average. But last year it was good to see that we were slightly better. We had a real anomaly last year. Of those 24, 1/3, that is 8 of them, were total malfunctions. Currency, just one word, yeah? We've just come out of COVID. A lot of people hadn't jumped for a while, and then all of a sudden we're having total malfunctions left, right and centre. One individual had 2. We had a couple of student totals, and then lots of experienced jumpers just can't find the handle. So just goes to show in real terms what we kind of already know in our head. When we are not current, we are much more vulnerable to being involved in an incident. So we need to be extra ready for those kind of things. Injuries, there were 82, that's 1 in 2,554. Langer had 8 or 7? 7 injuries. Yes, we had 7. So that put us at about 1 in 5,000. So in fact, our injury rate really was good last year. You know, of those 7, only 2 were deemed to be serious, and that is where people who are hospitalised and typically require operations. Both of those were qualified people. You used to sort of see the range being around the 300 jump mark. That's where people were downsizing a little bit quicker than they should be. They should have waited to the 500 jumps before they did that. And then we see them breaking their legs or something. We didn't see anything dramatic like a low turn last year, but we did see a couple of qualified jumpers really just fluff their landings. A lot of either just indecisive, and with your modern canopy, you start doing this, it's going to wobble you into the ground. You're almost always going to load your ankle. And in both cases we had, one was a broken and dislocated ankle, the other was tib, fib and ankle. Okay. Primarily they reached for the ground as well, so they put their toe down. You could see the mark on the top of the foot where the foot had been pulled backwards. That's when the tib and fib had gone, and that's also where your ankle had detached. We go back to the fundamentals of student jumping. Students are taught to have their feet and knees together and their toes up ahead of them when they land. We are not designed, unless you're a very trained ballerina, to be wandering around on our toes a great deal. It just doesn't give us any movement. So the fundamentals can be important as a qualified jumper. You know, PLF is something, I'm never going to need that, I know what I'm doing, but every so often, if you're going to fall over, just make sure your toes are up, and that can save an awful lot of problem. Statistics are statistics. 2 people out of 30,000 jumps, you only need to have 1 less or 1 more, and it makes an immense difference and skews all the, you know, they're not real sort of statistically viable facts. But generally, we have quite a good sort of low injury rate. The others were fairly minor little bits and bobs where people had just sort of fallen over. We had a dislocation on an unstable deployment with a student, sort of just the oddities that you really don't see very often. So we did pretty well. Still get the common rubbish. We didn't have any step-throughs or inversions last year. A couple of years before that, 2018, that accounted for 1 in 5, a fifth of our malfunctions, were people just not packing their kit properly. But we did still have the oddities, plenty of brake fires and silly stuff, or couldn't get my brakes off because I didn't set them properly. We had a guy who knew his new parachute system that he bought secondhand did not have the correct deployment bag, so he decided to order the new one from the manufacturer, specifically the right size, but he thought he'd bling it up a little bit and have all the tuck tabs, the semi-stoler stuff, because that's cool and groovy. Didn't have any interest in learning how to pack that, put the lines out the bottom in completely the wrong way. Wasn't surprised afterwards, but I think he was surprised by the bag lock at the time. Yeah, pick that out and feel, it's like, well, that's really obvious. The lines don't come out this corner, they come out the, oh, I didn't know that, I just thought the flaps just ask. Okay, so the really silly ones are, you know, and 1 in 24, we don't need to get rid of many of those to actually make the whole world a lot safer, all right? And the currency thing that we pointed about. Can you see what's going on in the left photo? It's not right. Both of these were taken at Lagan, relatively recently actually, and oddly enough, we very rarely see this. So the piece of string here goes over the middle ring. That little ring is completely not doing anything. It's irrelevant. It's just sort of conveniently tucked out of the way, so we don't. So basically, you've got the load going through the large ring straight into the middle ring, and then the piece of string. This guy had a dozen jumps on this kit. I think this was the one where he sort of went, yeah, I did take them apart a number of weeks ago and thought I'd got it together. So that was spotted by one of the jumpers nicely, and we took a photo of that. Oddly enough, you rarely see it, and then we saw exactly the same. I found this on the flight line 2 weeks later. He just had a reserve repack, put the kit back together, and had done almost exactly the same. So just be a little careful when we're playing with the 3 rings, we've removed them or anything else. At the same time, interestingly, we have the AAD there, completely random. We had 2 people yesterday with their AADs misset. One was in tandem mode, one was set to fire 150 metres higher. Basically, just keep pressing the red button until you get numbers, keep pressing, get very excited, give up eventually and just put it on your back. Was the situation there. So learn and know what your AAD should do and then when you turn it on, just make sure that it does actually go to the end of the sequence as you expect it to do. We've not had one, but we have actually. We've had an AAD fire where they put it in tandem mode. Some AADs do not turn themselves off if they believe to be in flight mode, depending on which sort of software programming you have. So it's not even, you can't even say this vigil will, and but some vigils will, some vigils won't. So we had a kit a few years ago. He'd lent it to his mate. The mate had been jumping in Paris in the States. The AAD had been left on at that point. It had then flown transatlantic back to here. It had then remained in this guy's house for 2 weeks, but that was above the 150 foot it was for that unit to make the unit believe it was in flight mode, so it stayed on. He got here, he brought the kit out. Yeah, AD's on. Bit weird. Told his four-way teammate, yeah, my AD's on. And they went, well, turn it off, turn it back on. Yeah. Go jump, did second jump, AAD fired on deployment. Oh, I didn't turn it off, and it was basically set to Paris mode, and we've had something very similar. So be careful with your AADs. They are great devices, and there's absolutely no doubt that they save lives, but we still need to know how the thing operates, how it works basically. Yeah, it's just kind of a push shut thing. So that's one, a lovely one on the right. You can probably see that individual's wearing a wingsuit. Yeah. This is the bridle line here. You gotta wonder how this person did their gear check in the morning. Actually, he'd given the kit to the rigger. The rigger had packed the reserve. The rigger had said to him, "Do you want me to do a main inspection and repack the main?" The bloke said no. Saves him a fiver, of course. So the kit had been returned like this. There is some debate whether the pilot chute had been returned to the VOC pocket or left out, depending on which story you want to listen to. Either way, the pilot chute found itself to be repacked and placed back in the VOC pouch. However, the rigger believed this to be fairly obvious as an indicator, and had verbally said to this guy, "You need to repack the main." The guy had gone, "Well, it's obviously the container's closed, so he must have repacked it anyway." All right, and presented himself to the flight line. So just be careful, I mean, this was I would say an educated jumper who I've known for a long time, who categorically knew that wasn't right and just couldn't explain why he just sort of kept going. Oh, it must be okay because I gave this to a rigger and he gave it back to me yesterday, so it must be okay. It's good that you have wonderful belief in people, very experienced people, but I make mistakes sometimes, just because I'm letting these people jump doesn't mean I'm making the right decisions right now. So I try and make the right decisions most of the time, and to some extent the most important thing I do is at least make a decision. But don't be afraid to make your own decisions, or come and ask advice. Because as soon as we went, oh, on the flight line, as his lift was looking at me going, "It's not right, is it?" Didn't you know the answer to that? So that was and then it was like, right, stand still, I'm taking a photo of this. All right. There we go. Left one. Disturbingly common. The tip of the toggle goes through the ring. So essentially, a good yank on that. The first thing that will happen is the loop will pull through the ring. It'll then snag briefly on here, and then it'll probably tear up the side. You can see the tip of the toggle only goes to here. So what you often see when you've got tears up either side, it just means at some stage the individual's not set the brakes. Then you'll have a brake fire, and that can lead to sort of things that are unnecessary later on. Yeah. Well, how have they done that? Okay, could they have done this if their closing loop was the correct length? No. So, sometimes you have this chain of events that is just, unnecessary. So in this situation, the pins go through. That was not taken here. I took that from a riggers group. But essentially, you've got this situation where the closing loop is too long. Subsequently, when they've popped the pin in, they've just not been paying any attention. It's gone all the way through. They've taken the pull-up out, and they've ended up with this situation. You can also see quite a lot of crinkling here. A collapsible pilot chute should not have crinkling in the outside the snakeskin. That indicates that your kill line is too short, or you've not cocked it properly. You should always have a taut outer side, and when you cock it, the tapes on the inside, the support tapes inside the pilot chute should equally be tight. This type of white line that they've used here, microline, spectra, polythene, it's plastic bags essentially, shrinks over time. It's commonly used for the kill line on because it's nice and slippy. It's one of the strongest lines we use for parachutes, but it is not dimensionally stable. It shrinks over time, so it remembers being a blob of plastic and just wants to be that way. And you know, the more you work it, the more you rub it, the more it tends to go back to that situation. All right. So there's a few things where you can see how we get from 24 malfunctions to 12 malfunctions very easily. And what I rely on is you guys to do that. I can't necessarily do that for you. You have to look after yourself to some extent. So here's the other phase of the first part this morning. I'll try and get more of the theory stuff done this morning while you're awake, and then we'll do a little bit more. The other plan is to have Kaylee's going to do a little bit on safety on the drop zone. Actually, it's about how to be safe in other environments when you're here, being safe with each other. There's no inclusivity, working with the people that are here. Nick is going to do something probably on Canopy flight, and then also Matt is going to do a little session, only about 10-15 minutes, on break-off, particularly break-off from formations and how to deal with that as the formations get larger. So that is the sort of basic essence, interspersed with anything else that you guys want. So, canopy collisions. We jump at a centre with bigger aircraft these days. We're not jumping out of a 206 with 4 or 5 people involved, and as a result of that, there's a lot more of us flying around, and we're flying around at very different speeds. We have such a broad range of canopies and canopy sizes. We now have an individual here jumping a 67 square foot Valkyrie, and that's flying next to someone on a Navigator 300 or a tandem on a 340 or even a 360. So the speed and the descent rate and the movement of people around the sky is far broader than it ever used to be. Historically, the suggestion always was that the lower person had right of way, but there's now that understanding that the lower person right now may not be the first person to land anymore. So those people higher up have to understand that the lower people do have right of way, but they also have to be conscious about where they will be in that sort of landing pattern later on to avoid a canopy collision. A lot of that comes through poor planning. If you are flying around at height, then you can see where everyone else is on your load. You've probably got some idea of who they are, the type of flying they have, the type of thing they may do that catches you out later on, and then you can plan where your landing point is. Chris, when he arrives with his great spirals, his infinity turns, comes out of that and swoops across the ground, didn't just decide to do that at 900 foot. He was under canopy at 3,000 feet. He's probably already worked out where everybody else is on the lift, who's above him and out of the equation, and who he has to consider and where his gap is. And some days he'll do it, and some jumps he won't, because there isn't that gap. And that's the other thing that changed last year with the HPLA and the new sort of CT rules, is that if you're doing high performance turns, you categorically can only do that if the entire airspace that you want to use is perceived to be clear. So we don't want situations where people who are higher doing these high performance turns interfere with other people. There's now a very clear hierarchy where students have absolutely priority over everybody else, including you guys. People making just the standard straight in landings are then next, and then we've got things like the high performance landers after that. Much better footage. Deployment. It's difficult to see. This brake's not set. So there's our first point. The guy who set the brakes probably wouldn't necessarily have been in this situation. So this starts with a brake fire. This guy is looking up at his canopy, his hands are reaching up, he's collapsed the slider already, and he's opening his visor. He's not looking around as to seeing what's going on, and then we subsequently have a collision. What do you think to his emergency procedures? The speed and the way he responds to that isn't the neatest. You can assume, looking at the ground, he still has a reasonable amount of altitude to deal with that. So this was two people prattling around. This is here. Let's fly next to each other. They are shouting at each other, but you can hear them from the ground. They're looking at their altimeters. They're considering their possibilities. Guy there, another alti check, quick look around him to see what's going on. They both land with good canopies. It's good, isn't it? It gets your heart going. Okay. We're not going to go into exit separation necessarily, and all of that part of thing. But you can make the general assumption that most of the time you exit sufficiently far away from the other group. It's expected that on deployment, if you and the other group are pointing directly at each other up and down line of flight on deployment, you have a little under 10 seconds to impact. Okay, so probably about 8 seconds to do something about it. From the moment you've let go of your pilot chute, you have about 8 seconds. That's the standard expectation. Okay, some people slide around in free fall, some people move, so it can be a little bit shorter. But you've got at least 5 seconds, but maybe you only have 5 seconds to identify the hazard and avoid them. Fundamental stuff then on deployment is avoidance. Understand what line of flight is, which way the aircraft is flying, and so on. So where do collisions generally happen? Yeah. Okay, at what stage during our canopy flight do we often see, or no, we see them so rarely, but there are two particular zones that are the most common. Just after deployment, yeah, and also coming into land. So that end of the crosswind turning into wind zone is the other sort of danger block, if you like. So they're the sort of 2 points. Shortly after deployment, often with your teammate or someone that was participating in the same jump as you, although not necessarily. And then also just at the end of that crosswind base leg, the sort of 300-400 feet zone, as people are getting almost a little over focused on where they want to land, and they're just losing some of that outside awareness as to where and what people are doing. So avoidance, this is the key part to canopy collisions, is don't have them. Awareness during the jump, who is on board this aeroplane? Where am I in that sort of relative setup? Who's getting out before me? Who's getting out after me? What heights do we expect people to be deploying at? Do bear in mind that consolidation students or others deploy at bizarre heights for unknown reasons, so we cannot always assume that. I did put my feet into an AFF student's canopy once because they told me what height they were pulling at. We unfortunately had opening canopies directly facing each other, and he pulled 1,000 feet higher than I thought he would, so he surprised me with a pilot chute sort of thing. So awareness during break-off and tracking, Matt's going to cover a little bit of that, but as we jump in larger groups, our slice of the pie becomes a little bit less. We can compensate for that by having staged break-offs. Group 1 goes and moves away, stage 2 then doesn't need to track quite so far. So understanding where we're tracking to, rather than just super track as far as I can. When you get to the bigger formations, if you're in the second wave to leave, you actually don't want to be pelting it off as far as you can. You've got to see where group 1 is and be careful about catching them up. group one, as they leave with a big formation, really has to focus on actually not max tracking and but actually keeping up with the formation and then peeling off. So they have to have a slightly steeper profile at first so that they are visible and at the same level as the other groups. And then the CT training, tap, traffic, altitude and position. As soon as we're open, we should be fully looking for traffic. As we wave off, we often have the opportunity just to be aware of other people who could be a bit closer to me than I wanted to. And then subsequent to that, you know, where I am altitude-wise, where I am positionally, and that is over the ground where I'm flying right now, also helps me with my safety. If I deploy and realise that I am a little deep, I don't want to actually fly directly down line of flight or up line of flight. You know, I want to avoid where potentially the other people are right now. And then the CT training, canopy handling, CH if you had it previously, was very, very similar. The concept that we can steer and direct our parachutes. And now, increasingly in recent times, the C license requires you to be briefed on dealing with ancillary things. When we go back to the footage, the guy has a brake fire, the other guy is visibly doing stuff like sliders and visors and loosening chest straps or all the other bits and bobs that we do. He's put that as a higher priority rather than, oh, Jimmy over there. You know? So have a look around. We had an off landing 2 years ago. Guy turned out to be fine. He's jumping with his friend, exactly the same wing loading, exactly the same canopies, did a lovely little two-way. And one guy just couldn't understand how his mate had landed comfortably here, and he was pretty much in the trees on the far side. And his mate did all the work for me. He said, well, you're an idiot. He said, I saw you flying that way endlessly. You were taking your booties off. What else were you doing? He said, oh, I was just opening the visor. And I was like, yeah, and you're flying the wrong way all the time during this. He was like, oh yeah. Okay, so general awareness of how to fly our parachute and our parachute's performance is key as well. Other stuff. What did Bill Booth say about the choices that we make on the ground? The way we've packed our parachute. If you don't have a brake fire, if that guy had not had a brake fire, probably wouldn't have had that collision because he'd have been in control, even though the other person was still messing around. It only takes one person to avoid a collision or be in a position. So the packing, the canopy choices that we make. If our parachute is moving us around more quickly, is more volatile potentially on deployment, there is more risk of deployment problems such as twists, then we have chosen to increase our risk, not just in that area, risk of having to get away, but also the risk of being in an initial position where perhaps we have less control or authority over where we are at that stage. The people you jump with, you know, if Mr. X is well known for not tracking very well, and you go jump with him, there we go. You know, if you're doing something, a tracking dive where the leader doesn't follow the flight plan that you have described and puts you back close to line of flight, further up next to the next, then you know the people you've chosen to jump with have put you in a more vulnerable position. So all the sort of decisions that we make early on can actually have a broad influence on the safety later on as well. Many jumpers are simply jumping parachutes that are too small for them to safely manage the canopy traffic on every jump. That's written by the USPA in their area about tips to avoid canopy collision. A manufacturer's representative always said to me that most of his customers, he thought, were buying canopies that they could deal with about 90% of the time. It was always his frustration when, you know, they felt that their next canopy had to be smaller than their current one. Someone asked Joe Lamming yesterday, what are you downsizing to next when you get your next canopy? And just looked completely baffled and he said, no, I think I'm upsizing for the next one. It'll be more fun. Okay. So select a parachute that you can cope with all the time. Know how to fly it. Oh yeah, my phone's still on too. Trying to put them on silent at some point. Avoidance on the flight down. Pay attention to who is on your load. If there's a load of students, then they're unlikely to be close to you. If you are lower them, they're unlikely to be catching up. But you do get that one person spiral. There were lots of stories today. 2 4-way teams, 4-way 1 opened, 4-way 2 opened, cameraman on second 4-way was essentially therefore quite high. Spiral, fly to DZ, clip, hit. It was a body-to-body impact under Canopy with one of the first members of the first 4-way. You know, it was very fair to say, and the individual who was the cameraman said, "Hey, you know, I was flying in a straight line. He turned and hit me." Very true. So we could blame the 4-way person, but equally the comment at that stage was, well, "How did you two get into the same bit of sky?" And the other, well, he was up there, and then he spiralled down to me just to where I was flying in my bit of sky, and it was sort of, well, that is also true. You know, they managed to get themselves into the same bit of sky, and the cameraman, you know, was very honest, but he said, "Oh, well, I do like spiralling." So there's an element of lack of sort of forethought overall. I want to spiral, I want to have fun, but actually they're all down there. I'm up here, all on my own. I think I'll just add a little bit of brakes. I'll just stay up here a little bit longer and let the debris, as I call it, that way. You know? Sometimes you're on that load where we all know each other. You know, you're perhaps looking at those 1 or 2 people and, I don't want to be anywhere near him under Canopy. I think we're getting better at that, but you know, over the years I've known certain individuals where I thought that's the one to watch under Canopy. Dean won't care if I mention Dean. Dean flies a Fury, a 7-cell. He sits over the landing point on relatively deep brakes, sinking it down, and then does a little surge for his landing. That's a very acceptable way of doing things on a 7-cell Fury. Accuracy is the type of thing that was completely normal on the drop zone through the 80s and early 90s. It's perhaps less compatible with what we are jumping these days with the faster and higher performance parachutes, but you know, sometimes people aren't necessarily doing things wrong, but they're flying their parachutes with a different mode, a different type of flight. So they're the just sort of things we can consider planning ahead. Know the direction of the jump run and where the spot is. That becomes even more significant when we have the wingsuiters and the tracking and everything else. You know, if your tracking leader has taken you in the right direction initially, but then brought you back to flight line, your ability to, if not recognised at the time, immediately deploy, think, well, I must be really close to that. This is not where I thought I'd be opening. I need to just go that way, not that way, because we're on line of flight at this stage. So, you know, a clear idea of where you expect to be under Canopy, and then the ability to adapt if you're not where you expect to be in your little cube of air as we go up jump run, then that allows you to be a little bit more careful. And then once under Canopy, locate all other canopies and identify threats. Threats being them. Other avoidance tips. Use your Canopy flight skills to change when you land relative to others. So yeah, if we're up there nice and high and there's plenty of space, you know, and we can see the people below us, we don't need to spiral, we don't need to be aggressive with our inputs, we just need to sit and wait. When we do display jumps, you see this in particular. You know, person 1 getting out the aeroplane should land first, 2, 3, 4. We should see this really disciplined stack, and you see the first person suddenly sitting on brakes. That's not fair because he's stuffing the other 4 people up. Number 5 knows that they pull highest, but also they've just got to sit on half brakes and just cruise around and let everything sort of just feed away from them so they have more space. It can be done here. You'll see Chris flying around pretty much on deep brakes, waiting for that gap. He's just like a hawk up there. Where's my prey? Here it comes. And around I go. You know, he's looking at where the other people are, letting them get out of the way. Sometimes you can be flying around thinking, okay, I'm here, there's that person, I need to just sort of full drive, penetrate a little bit more down and get myself just around that person. So they're the sort of hazards that you can see. If you know where people are, you've got a very good idea as to what's happening next. Expect the unexpected. People will do things that you don't expect. That sudden S-turn coming into land, which again used to be a sort of taught feature 20 years ago, but now we don't want anything other than a relatively predictable, you know, turn left into land. You will get the odd right-hand pattern or go to another centre. It could be different. You know, there are places where they fly a left-hand pattern in one area, right-hand pattern in another area. There are drop zones where they literally have a demarcation line down the centre, and this side is left and that side's right-hand pattern, so you get almost this sort of interference point in the corner. So understand what the requirement is, but then also expect the unexpected. But equally, if we can also know what the system is, the predictability helps remove some of the potential unexpected. You can start to predict that person is about to do something unpredictable. That person is clearly way over there. They can't make a left-hand pattern, so that's the person I can see and need to just keep an eye on, because they're going to do something that I might need to just adjust my flight plan to account for. Only takes one person to avoid the collision. It takes two people to be involved. This is a poster produced by the British Parachute Association, so you can see it's got a little bit of age to it, but it's just as relevant. So avoiding canopy collisions, jumping with others, break off at a sensible height. Actually, break off heights have progressively gone up. There are other, I won't say they were dark days, but I've been on 4 ways breaking off at 3,500 feet, and the idea of doing that these days is ridiculous. A good flat track, learn how to track well, how to track to the point where you should be, and that's the bigger formation concept. Look around you when you're close to others when deploying, give a good wave off, and then during deployment be ready straight away to take action on rear risers. So the original CH stuff, we got you to do this as part of the B license stuff. They've bumped it to later on, which is probably not a bad idea, having people on higher kit, big 230s, trying to influence it with front and rear risers is a bit of a nonsense in some cases, because all that happens is you lift yourself up out the harness, you put yourself back down in the harness. So they have moved it justifiably, I think, to simplify the CT1, and then the CT2 came in for your C license. But that is all about brakes are set, canopy is, we don't even need to wait till the canopy being fully open before we add a rear riser input, and it will respond. But if we jab on it too early, actually it's still not got to that flight mode, it's in inflation mode, and as a result of that it really doesn't respond well. So we can learn over many jumps at what stage it will take an input from us. Make sure you've got clear skies before we do all the other stuff. You know, we lead complicated lives now when we're turning our cameras off, we're opening our visors, we're stowing the sliders. I mean, the visor, the slider, none of that existed 20 years ago. We just deployed our parachute, took the brakes off. Now it's a little bit more to people loosen their chest strap perhaps if they're wanting to be a bit more comfortable. There's a lot more stuff to do. Some people take their booties off. There's no way I'm flexible enough to get down there, to be honest. And then on the way down, keep an eye out all the way. Maintain altitude awareness, put that into the modern terms, TAP, traffic, my altitude and where I am, my position across the ground keeps me safe. What happens if it goes wrong? Are you in trouble, or are there ways or basic rules that can help you? First thing is stay calm. All right? A canopy collision will be broadly very exciting for a short period of time. Make a plan. Actually, have a plan. You know, it's no good in the air, in a situation like that, trying to invent some new rules. You should all really have a good understanding, which is why we do safety day. You know, and that's true for everything. You know, people ask us, should I cut away if I have a pilot shoot and tow? The answer is there's merits to anything that you do as long as you survive. The honest answer is don't start inventing stuff at 2,000 feet when you're in free fall with a pilot shoot and tow. Just know what you're going to do in whatever situation you're presented with, and then respond to that. Do I cut away to a pilot shoot and tow? Is about 45 minutes of me talking. Communicate. Most of the time you can talk to each other in these situations. I've done very few canopy formation stuff, but it's surprising how you can just chat to each other up there. So let's have a look at the plan idea. First question is, what situation are you in? You know, that's the simplest thing. A lot of people sometimes will say, oh yeah, I have malfunction, oh yeah, I have a canopy collision, I'm going to cut away. But it might not be necessary. So the first question is just a very simple one. Have you got a good canopy? You also need to be situationally aware. So what is your altitude? And then what's going on around you? If you've got a good canopy, what's the status of the other person? Are you entangled with them? Are they entangled with you? What's going to happen next? So this is a result of a CF jump, but it's a good representation of what's going on quite often in a canopy collision. you'll often find that we're not on a dead level. You know, we are staggered. In which case, you'll often find that typically the upper person is likely to have the better of the two canopies, probably or possibly a good canopy, and the lower person is trying to give you a sort of gift-wrapped affair, and maybe dealing with a little bit more complex stuff. So the general advice is, if you have a canopy collision, the first thing you want to ascertain is whether you have a good canopy. The other person hopefully will be doing the same thing. If it's yes, then the likelihood is the best option is for you to stay with your main. You know? And there have been silly situations over the years where people have had unnecessary injuries or indeed fatalities where they cut away good canopies, both in this situation and when they've had two out, you know, reserve wrap around their leg, good main, two out, mouth, oh yeah, off we go, and then they've realised or regretted what they've done. I would assume they've regretted what they've done afterwards. So really, do you have a good canopy? And if you have, chances are there's no point doing much else at that stage. If you don't, then you've got to think altitude-wise. There is one group of skydivers, unfortunately, that consistently cuts away below 500 feet and hits the floor without a reserve being open, and it is qualified jumpers. You don't get it with students. Students look up, they see something very minor at 3,500 feet, and it's you know, all right, a reserve at 3,000 feet, probably a student. It's the bod who's got these qualifications, who wants to fix things, to make, I've got the intelligence, I know how to sort this out, who get lower and lower and lower. So, aside, as a qualified jumper, just don't go below 2,000 feet. The rules we teach students are applicable to anybody at this stage. Never be below 2,000 feet without a parachute that you intend to land safely. Forget all this stuff. You know, twists are one of those things that may now become a non-resolvable situation, unlike the way you were taught as a student. Try and kick them out and then make the decision. That's another example where we see people kick, pause, you think, good, they're checking their, no, they've gone back to kicking and now they're at 1,500 feet and now they're cutting away low. Right. So, canopy collisions are really the one event that can occur below that 2,000 feet threshold. So it does have to be skewed a little bit. So if we don't have a good canopy, check your altimeter. Is cutting away a viable option? You've not just got to consider the state of your canopy and your altitude, but also where you are, you know, in terms of, are you the person hanging out the bottom? Potentially you are. Do you have the freedom to cut away? Is it clear space below you? If you're above 3,000 feet, hence the word option here, you can cut away and follow your normal procedures. You have time and altitude to do that if you're efficient. The option being, you know, just double check that that is going to function the way you want it to do. You know, if you are physically attached in some other way to their parachute, then it may be a little bit more complex. So the thing with canopy collisions is every single one is different, so there is a little bit of dynamic thought going on. But as a general principle, if you have the opportunity and you have the height to do so, then it's a good idea. And if not, you do have the option of deploying the reserve. If you are in a position where you do not have a good main and you're below 1,000 feet, you need to decide whether a reserve parachute will create more fabric. Someone said to me many years ago, an instructor, that 2 malfunctions will fall slower than 1. Yeah. Is it a viable option, or is it going to cause more problems? The general opinion is that it probably will produce a better result than not, but we can't be sure for every condition. You may even end up with a reserve sort of inflating and then the option to cut away and do a canopy transfer. Not something we'd ever talk to students about, because then they think they can start pulling handles in the wrong order. Never cut away below 1,000 feet is standard information for our students, but it's equally effective for you guys. Although I've said actually a lot of people that cut away low are qualified jumpers. There have been a few fatalities in the UK where students have cut away at low level, unfortunately. So that's a really sort of important piece of information. Reserve parachutes take time to open, whether you have an RSL or a skyhook or some other main assisted reserve deployment that is supposed to speed things up. At the end of the day, fundamentally the ground is there And if we're low to the ground, cutting away is possibly not a viable option. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we teach students this. This is a flow chart very similar to that as part of the malfunction session. Check canopy. If you've got a good canopy, stay with it. If you do not have a good canopy, altitude above 1,000 feet. If you're above, cut away. If you're below, pull the reserve handle. So we've made it simplified. We've removed some of the options about communication and what's going on. It's just a very simple decision tree, and it works. STC, can't remember whether it's beginning of last year or just a little bit before, we looked at some footage of a qualified jumper surviving a low cutaway following a collision, and the essence was if only they followed the stuff that we teach students, they'd have actually been far, far better off. I think they put the handles in a different order and did all sorts of stuff. And the essence was this guy with, I believe they had over 1,000 jumps, really just was, you got the impression they were making it up as they went along rather than having a basic understanding of this. It's sad to say that we had a double fatality in 2010 as a result of a canopy collision from two people. Very experienced, they were in a six-way, they collided very quickly after deployment. I unfortunately believe that had they have followed the same rules that we provide as students, I think we'd have looked at a different outcome from that. So these things can be messy, but at the same time they can be survivable. These are the best pieces of advice that we have for you. Whilst we've said have a plan, at the same time you do have a little bit of education and experience to be able to be a little bit adaptive, but these fundamental building blocks are perceived and expected to be the safest way to deal with these things.
Sorry.
Hi.
So it's the safety day, is it?
Yes.
Rob jumped in a bit late?
Pretty much, but by all means come in. It's very flexible and fluid.
No worries, thank you.
We generally, do you want to put the kit downstairs somewhere?
Yeah,
so it's
no
out of the
worries.
way. We're trying to not have any kit up here. We don't want it as a kit store. Okay, again, the British Parachute Association recommendation. Stay calm, check the problem. Do you have an entanglement? Do you have a canopy? Can you untangle yourself? Can you resolve the problem? Be altitude aware, or if you can't, ask the jumper what height you're at. And then if you're able to cut away without making the problem worse for you or the other person, make sure you have the clear capacity to do that. So that's just a general piece of advice. Planning is key. Have a good idea of how you will deal with a canopy collision. They're so super rare, we can almost discount them. But the feature there is if we discount them, we forget about them. So we do just need to think about them occasionally, and that's why we do these sort of things in Safety Day. It's just a little mental jog. Before all of your jumps, just have a good idea who you've got on your load, understand your line of flight, and go from there. Put a plan into action on every jump. What I'm really meaning there is understand how you would deal with it, what you would do if you were to have a collision on your next jump. Any questions?